Welcome, everybody. Over the past week in our grade 12 law class, we've spent a little bit of time looking at the foundations of international law. And in particular, we've talked a little bit about where international law came from, why international law is so important from a historical perspective, and also a little bit in terms of just how international law is in many ways very, very different from the easier to follow and a little bit easier to sort of comprehend sets of laws that exist within the domestic sphere. Today, we're going to look at a very important aspect of international law, which really has long, long historical roots, and that's the concept or idea of treaties. In particular, today we'll look at three different details with regards to treaties. The first we'll look at is just the question of what is a treaty, and we'll look at what treaties are and what they represent. We'll also very briefly touch upon how treaties are used in the modern day. And in particular, we'll look at a number of areas where treaties exist between Canada and the United States. And you'll see treaties are extremely important to that particular relationship. And then finally, and this will be the majority of our focus, we'll talk a little bit about the treaty making process itself. We'll look at the different stages that have to be followed for a proper internationally respected treaty to be negotiated between two or more parties. The reality is that if you're going to be looking at treaties, treaties are something that are very, very old. They're really as old in terms of the concept as the general sort of principle of civilization itself. As long as you've had civilizations where there are governments or groups of people who represent others within their community and who have come into contact with different civilizations and have needed to negotiate certain agreements, then there's been a need for treaties. Okay, and in fact, treaties exist in all parts of the world in many different manners or in many different forms. If you're going to be defining a treaty is actually pretty easy to define. It's essentially an agreement that exists between two parties, and in this particular case, the two parties would be nations representing groups of people. It's actually similar in many respects to a type of law that we've already talked about, which is contracts. You'll recall that if you look at a private legal system, a contract is a formal, recognized agreement between two parties where they've agreed to certain behavior and they've agreed that that behavior should be enforced with certain consequences, of course, if people break the terms of the agreement. Internationally, you're looking at a fairly similar thing with treaties. They essentially represent the contract or the agreement between two or more nations, and they often come with the treaty a particular understanding of what the consequences might be if that particular agreement happens to be broken by one or more of the countries that sign it. If you look at the actual terms used to describe treaties, you'll notice that there's lots of names or terms that are often used. I've put a few of these up on the screen and you can see them here. Convention, protocol, agreement, memorandum of understanding, accord. That's not an exhaustive list. There's many other terms that, of course, could be used as well. One of the key things you should understand, though, is that all of these terms are, while they're slightly different, essentially synonymous, and they all represent the idea that there's an agreement between parties, and the agreement between parties represents many people who those parties negotiate on behalf of. Final point, treaties are not new. Okay, and in fact, some treaties, as you'll see, like for example in the picture here, some treaties go back thousands, if not thousands or more years. In terms of the relationship between Canada and the United States, certainly that's a very strong one. And taking a little bit more of a modern focus, there are lots of issues where agreements between our country, Canada, and the United States are, are essential. They're very important. Sometimes agreements can be made on an individual issue basis, and not every aspect of the relationship between Canada and the United States is necessarily covered in treaty form. But because there's so much complexity to the way we work with the United States, and because there's such a growing need over the years, or has been, for clear rules for how we should engage with one another in terms of different issues, then there's been a growing number of treaties that have developed to help guide and sort of provide, particular rules that our countries can follow as they negotiate within those particular spheres. Just to give you a couple of examples, and you'll notice that on the left I've listed quite a number of areas where a lot of treaties do tend to govern our relationship. One would involve trade. You'll know that over the years, Canada and the United States have developed a very close trade relationship. We have free trade in many essential goods and services between our countries, and also between our two countries and Mexico. Mexico, of course, since 1994 has been a part of that agreement. That's a very complicated relationship, and having NAFTA to develop rules and patterns for how that trade should occur has greatly facilitated for a growth of connection in terms of our economies between the two countries, especially over the last 30 years. Another issue where you're going to see that treaties become important involves extradition. If you have a person who's Canadian and they happen to commit a crime, unfortunately, in the United States, and let's say it's first degree murder. Well, if you commit first degree murder in Texas, one of the dilemmas that you'll face is that the justice system there is very different from what you would see in Canada. The death penalty is quite regularly used. Should a Canadian actually have to potentially face the death penalty if they commit a crime in another country? Well, the reality is that they may not, but we have what we call extradition agreements to try to hopefully help guide the conversations about what should happen to people in those circumstances. And certainly there are opportunities through extradition agreements that happen or exist between Canada and the United States to try to make sure that the standards of justice are more even than they would be if they didn't have those rules in effect. A final issue, and I'll finish with this point, would be refugees. Obviously, you'll know that over the last few years, one of the big issues that's often come up is that Canada tends to have a little bit more of an open, or I guess what some might term progressive policy in terms of acceptance of refugees than what's existed within the United States. Um, Ignoring the political sort of discussion about whether that's a good or a bad thing, the fact that Canada has slightly different rules for refugees than the United States has often meant that there's different standards for what should happen when they come into our countries and perhaps move from one border across into the next. And in fact, to help guide those situations and the negotiations that go into dealing with those people in those cases, there's a number of different agreements that exist between the two countries to help set rules and help set foundations. And of course, they're heavily debated. They're the sort of, I guess, foundation for a lot of public discussion and public debate, but they do exist, and they definitely make dealing with that issue a lot easier than it would be if you didn't have those treaties in practice. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about treaties, and we've talked a little bit about just why they're important in the current context. What we're going to look at now, it's really the core part of the lesson today, is we're going to look a little bit at just how treaties are actually made. What does it take for two countries that want to negotiate and develop an agreement between themselves to actually take that agreement that they've proposed and turn it into a formal codified treaty that's accepted and recognized by nations of the world as part of international law? Historically, treaties have long been negotiated. And up until the early to mid part of the 20th century, there didn't really tend to be a lot of very specific codes for how they would actually be worked out. Rather, most treaty negotiation up until the early 20th century was guided through generally understood customs or conventions for what a treaty should look like and how it should be worked out, particularly within Europe and particularly within North America. Those customs conventions, you can think of them kind of like common law for the international forum. They generally worked, and they generally worked because the countries that were negotiating those deals had had long histories of fairly similar traditions and fairly similar perspectives on international law, and they just understood what those rules would be, and they understood how, if they broke those rules, they would often be seen as rogue states by other nations within their particular part of the world, and that would often make it hard for future treaties to be negotiated. It was kind of like an honor system, but it worked. Things started to become a lot more complex as the 20th century pushed forward, though. And part of the reason why that occurred was simple. As the 20th century started to make its way into its midpoint, and as World War II ended, and many, many more nations started to become more vocal, have more power, and become more representative of different people in the world, you started to get a lot more confusion about just what the rules for actual negotiation of agreements should be. And so nations of the world, like they were doing in a number of different areas of international law, decided to come together. They came together in a location which was in the center of Europe, which at least by those standards, it's obviously Eurocentric, but by the standards of the day made sense because it was within that context seen to be a neutral ground. So they went to Austria and they went to Vienna, and in Vienna they signed the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. And to this day, while it's a fairly basic agreement, it remains the key international standard for how treaties should be negotiated and how they should be, sort of recognized by countries of the world. We don't need to know everything in the Vienna Convention. I certainly don't, and you're not going to be tested in any way on that. But you should at least understand one key concept or one key sort of idea that came out of the Vienna Convention, and that is the particular steps that need to exist for a treaty to be brought into law. In a general sense, there are three core steps that need to be followed. And then, practically speaking, there's a fourth that, while it doesn't necessarily have to be followed for a treaty to actually have value or meaning, it really should be there as well. The first step, and we're going to look at these in more detail, but I'll introduce them very quickly now, is negotiation. And negotiation is just what it sounds like. If two countries want to work out a deal, or multiple countries, sometimes we call that multilateral negotiation. If multilateral situation exists where many countries want to work something out, those parties will come together. They'll talk about the issue with diplomats and leaders, and they'll try to work out a discussion of what they want to actually sign on to. Once the countries can negotiate a deal, and that may never happen, but assuming they do, they then reach a second stage of treaty making, which is the signing stage. It's worth noting, though, that signing doesn't necessarily make a treaty actually fully applicable in international law. It simply represents a goal of an agreement that is then brought back to the nations in question. The final step to make a treaty full and official is ratification, and ratification with or without reservations, which we'll talk about in a few minutes what that means. That's the actual formal making of a treaty into law following the legal sort of systems of the countries involved. That would make any treaty. And if you follow those three steps, you have an agreement that's recognized by the international community. The biggest challenge, though, is that countries actually have to do things. They have to agree and actually implement what's being agreed upon. And so, a final stage in a practical sense of useful treaty making is also implementation. Okay, and that's the idea that you don't just sign paper treaties that mean nothing, but rather that you actually do the things you've agreed upon so that there's a purpose or an actual power to that particular agreement, and it makes it a useful, functional thing. Okay, different countries may follow slightly different steps, and we'll see this when we talk about things like ratification. But all countries have to follow those three key steps, and really, for practical purposes, the fourth as well, if they want to have meaningful, useful treaties that everybody around the world recognizes as legitimate. First step for negotiating or developing a treaty is negotiation. Essentially, it's what it sounds like. People who represent the countries in question will come together and negotiate on the basis of a particular issue a set of agreements that they want to have all of the countries accept and follow. Typically, there's two groups of people who will negotiate. They include diplomats as well as leaders or representatives of each country. Diplomats, we'll talk about them a little bit more next week in terms of some of their particular rights and responsibilities. They're very, very old fashioned representatives of country. They go back hundreds of years, but what they are, they're people who actually are kind of like boots on the ground in different countries. They often live in the countries where we're going to be negotiating deals with. They often are familiar with the rules of engagement in terms of negotiation and conversation and social mores in those countries. They're also familiar with the general political situation in terms of the countries where you're negotiating because they're actually there. Whether or not we need them to the same extent that we once did in the 21st century is a debated idea. Certainly, there are some who've argued that they're not as necessary in a technologically advanced society like we have today. But there are a number of reasons why we still have them. And they play a key role because, of course, they are liaisons who understand the particular details of how things work in the countries where these agreements are going to actually be made with. Leaders are the other group that's important for treaty negotiation, and leaders are essentially just people who represent the governments of the day. They also might involve people who are bureaucrats and experts on the particular issue that's being discussed. So, for example, if you had an environmental treaty, you might actually bring some scientists as well, because, of course, they may be a need for scientific knowledge as well as just sort of political goals and ambitions in terms of the discussion. These discussions can happen anywhere. Sometimes they'll happen with multilateral treaties between many countries at the UN. So they may be discussed within different organs of the UN and negotiated there. Other treaties may happen more independently. So, for example, things like NAFTA, they weren't developed at the UN, but rather they developed through international sort of, or sort of locally agreed upon sites where Canada, United States, and Mexico came together with their different representatives to work out an agreement. Once negotiating parties think they have a deal, at that particular point, as I've mentioned, they will often sign it. That means that the signed treaty is getting closer to being put into official practice. It's important to note, though, that at that particular point, while you're well on your way, and not all negotiation leads to signing, by the way. Many times you can't get an agreement. But if you do get a signature from the different countries, you are getting closer. It doesn't actually make the agreement an official treaty yet. The signature simply means that each country will then take that proposed, think of it like a proposed agreement, back to their local legislatures and local governments. And at that particular point, based on the way that laws are made in different countries, they'll have to go through a formal approval process. And that formal approval process is what we call ratification. Uh, Treaties that are signed are close to being agreements, but they may actually take many years before they're officially put into law and they're officially put into practice. Now, when you're negotiating a treaty, there's lots of different things you can do. And because nations have sovereignty, we can't really tell two countries, in terms of other countries of the world, what they can or cannot agree to, with certain exceptions. There is, however, one thing that all nations do, in the general sense, have to accept if they're going to be negotiating a treaty. And that one thing, which you might guess, you can think about it right now, is this: treaties have to at least be agreed upon in a way where all parties accept them and no country is forced in any manner to sign. If a country is pressured, either militarily or economically or in some other manner, into signing a treaty, then there will often be a question in terms of its legitimacy. And certainly we've seen over history that when treaties are negotiated in a way where there's a power imbalance, and that power imbalance is leveraged to make one country, against its general will, come to an agreement that doesn't really represent the interest of its people, then those treaties often face considerable scrutiny and, in fact, may become rejected over time by the countries in question as people start to ask those difficult questions. One of the most famous examples of a problematic treaty in that respect was the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed in 1919 to end World War One. As you're probably familiar, the treaty was signed between the Allied countries that had won the war, so France, Great Britain, the United States, and the countries which had been the losers of the war, including most famously Italy and Germany. Italy and Germany had new governments at the time that were really just recovering their countries. The countries had been decimated by war and didn't really have a lot of bargaining power. And as such, they were forced to really accept pretty negative terms. And most historical experts would argue that over time it was a mistake. And it was a mistake because, in being forced to sign the Victor's Justice Agreement, the populations in both Italy and Germany felt very, very unfairly treated. And it actually, over the years, led to the collapse of more neutral governments, the rise of fascist governments in terms of Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, and then, of course, the tearing up of the Treaty of Versailles and the eventual move towards World War II. Had there been a more fair treaty and a little bit more of an even treaty, then we wouldn't have ended up at that particular point. Now, final detail that I want to discuss is the idea of ratification. As I mentioned, when a treaty is signed, it's not necessarily formal, and it actually may still take a lot of negotiation to get it into a formal state. Ratification is done by the individual governments that negotiate a treaty. Okay, and essentially, what happens there is that the treaty is brought back to their governments, and it has to be passed according to the rules for treaty passage in the individual countries. Sometimes treaties will be signed outright. So a country may just say, yes, that's a good deal, we'll sign it. Oftentimes, well, where it's more complicated, they may actually add reservations. And in fact, there may actually be sort of a back and forth between ratification and the negotiation stage. And so there may be requested reservations. You may go back to the negotiation tables, rework a treaty, rework a signature, and then come back and then eventually, hopefully, get to the final end of the line. If you look at trade agreements between Canada and some other countries, that's been an often complicated thing. We've been negotiating for the last 10 years or more a trade deal with Europe called the CETA. While we're fairly close to that particular deal, we're still not quite 100% there. And the biggest reason why is that there's been so many reservations by both parties as different governments have come into power and wanted different things, that it's taken a long, long time to get formal ratification through. Okay? In fact, it's a very, very complicated thing when it comes to that particular matter. How you negotiate and ratify treaties, sorry, how you ratify treaties, it depends on the countries. Different countries have different systems. In the United States, and this is notable, a president can only ratify a treaty if they have two-thirds Senate approval. And in fact, that's always been a famous thing in the United States because many times when presidents have wanted to sign international agreements, they've had agreements signed, they've thought that they had everything that they needed, they've gone back to the Senate, and the Senate has said no. And in fact, two-thirds approval is quite a high standard. It's a difficult thing sometimes, especially for more contentious issues, to actually get those formal treaties to exist. Another situation which you would see would be in Canada. In Canada, and there's a little bit of a debate about this, you don't even have to put through Parliament technically. Instead, the issue is simply ratified by Cabinet, which is the Prime Minister and the people who are in charge of various ministries that the Prime Minister of the day would appoint. Um, the government can choose to debate an issue and have a vote for it in the House of Commons, but they don't actually have to. Okay? And certainly, a lot of people have argued that that gives a lot of power to the Prime Minister and Cabinet and maybe in certain respects anti democratic. I won't really deal with this question right here today. We'll ask it within the homework that you're going to be looking at tonight. But there is a conversation about what are the big advantages to our system of giving just cabinet the right to ratify treaties versus the American system of having representatives have a fair amount of say as well. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about the pros and the cons. Final step I want to mention for developing a treaty is that even after treaties have been ratified, there's still a lot of hurdles that have to be overcome. The biggest is that you actually have to implement. Lots of countries may actually pass treaties, but oftentimes they may pass a treaty and not really do very much to actually follow through on it. And unless you actually want the treaty to have value and to actually fulfill its purpose that it was signed and ratified in order to sort of, I guess, provide for, then you actually have to honor the terms. It's not easy to create punishment or consequence for countries of the world that don't go along with the agreements they sign. And you will often find that countries will sometimes sign things, but they may not so easily actually follow the terms because, unlike in domestic law, where there's clear penalties when you break the law, in international law, there's not necessarily an overriding policing organization that will come in and do something. When you look at agreements like the climate agreements, both Kyoto and the more recent agreement that we've signed, Canada may have difficulty meeting its commitments. And one of the big questions that a lot of people would ask is that, well, if you're going to sign a treaty and you may not actually fully fulfill the things that you've agreed to do, then are you and the other countries of the world doing something that's meaningful or really just sort of setting goals and ambitions rather than having practical impact in terms of the law. And there you can just see the most recent version of NAFTA, which again has been a very complicated treaty to negotiate. Okay, your homework for tonight is fairly straightforward. There's a little bit of a reading in your textbook which talks about some of the ideas that I've just gone through. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to read pages 480 to 485, which reviews the treaty making process. And then using the handout which I've provided to you today, there's about 4 or 5 questions on treaty making in Canada and abroad. Please answer those questions and then we'll discuss them and sort of use that as a review of today's lesson in your next live lesson in a couple of days. Thank you, and I'll see you shortly.